Hello, humanities students. So, I know we are all gearing up for our big, scary term paper at the end of the semester, and I wanted to just sort of take some time, like make this its own class. I usually do this in person when I'm on campus, but I want to take some time and talk about what is actually involved in the process of writing your research paper. So I have one general how to write a knockout research paper video that I use for just about all of my classes at this point. But the process of research differs from class to class, subject to subject. So I wanted to sort of walk you through the process of looking for good sources for your research paper. And part of the reason I want to do this is not just because, I want to read good papers, although I do, and I want you to get good grades, though, again, I do. I want you to be able to do this at the drop of a hat because this is like one of the most important skills in contemporary life. Like, more than just in this class, more than just in your academic career, but like nowadays there's so much bullshit on the internet all of the time, and you really need to be able to, like, at the drop of a hat, be able to contradict somebody who's just giving you bad information or like false facts or getting their statistics from some nonsensical place. I find myself doing this all the time, and the faster you get at it and the better you get at it, the better you will be served. The internet is an incredible tool that is frequently misused. This is my attempt to sort of like teach you how to use it properly, especially in an academic context. Now, keep in mind, I've done exactly like 15 minutes of prep work before starting this video, so there's really not that much that is necessary in order to get a good source for your research paper or, for whatever research you are doing. This is not a hugely time-consuming process. But what I find is that most students who come to my classes really don't know how to do this. Like, I'm sure that you've already been to some sort of library presentation where they walked you through the databases and taught you how to, like, search something through JSTOR, and it is garbage. Like, the search engines that are used by JSTOR, at least back in the days when I used to use them, they were trash. You would get all sorts of garbage and reviews and things that were unhelpful for your cause. So I want to show you how to find a good source, the method that I use when I encounter some new subject that I'm not terribly familiar with. Um, but first is some general ground rules, like what exactly are we looking for in a good source. For this assignment, you were required to have two outside sources in addition to the two sources from the class that you're talking about. The paper is designed to contrast two myths from within the Faust or the Don Juan tradition, which can be interpreted fairly vague and broadly. And to sort of look at how each author prioritizes various elements or details according to their cultural situation and their specific priorities at the time. What that means for you is you should pick two myths, like Don Juan by Moliere and Don Giovanni by Mozart, or Faust by Goethe and maybe The Devil and Tom Walker by Irving. There's lots of potential matchups that you could use here. Go nuts, pick texts that you are familiar with, that you enjoyed in this class, that you feel relatively comfortable with, and then contrast the two. Ideally, you should be making one cogent argument. We'll be talking about that in the next video on how to write a knockout research paper, but you should have a vague idea of what you want to say going into your research process. So you'll remember back during my Milton lecture, I made the fairly controversial argument that Milton was arguing for the devil as evil and therefore for the supposed authority of God. Now, the thesis that if I were to write this paper, I would obviously need a second source. So let's go with not just Milton's Paradise Lost, but also we'll just use Irving's The Devil and Tom Walker to round it out. And the thesis that I'd like to present here is that both authors use the devil to characterize and condemn the evils of their time. Or rather, their respective time, let's say. That'll help us to sort of give us an idea of what we're looking for here. So with that in mind, again, my argument back during my lecture was that Milton was using the devil to sort of characterize the rebels at the time and how ultimately the authority of the monarchy was absolute, unquestioned. So let's dig into that. Now, the three kinds of sources that I want you to look for when you are doing your research paper, first and foremost, if you can, find contemporary scholars talking about the works that you're using. Those will probably be the most helpful sources to you because they will most directly be interacting with the texts that you want to talk about. The key here is that you need to find good contemporary sources, like scholarly writers who know this material, who know the background, who have studied it extensively. And this is occasionally tricky. Like, there's lots of books out there on virtually any of the texts that we've discussed in this class, some more than others. So, like, you will find endless volumes on Goethe's Faust. You will find tons of stuff on Paradise Lost. You will find tons of stuff on Dante's Inferno. You will find tons of stuff on Marlowe's Dr. Faustus. Some of the other works, like The Devil and Tom Walker, you'll probably find a little bit less on, but even so, you'll find tons of criticism out there. These are all works that are very richly discussed by the literary community, and you shouldn't have any problem finding articles or books or whatever to support what you are going to be looking through, to sort of like support the research process here. But that's not the only kind of source that you can use. One of the things that I've emphasized is that each of the writers that you were talking about should be placed in their historical context, which means you can absolutely, and I encourage you to do so, look for works that discuss their respective histories. So in the case of Milton, Milton's writing in 17th century England, so talking about the whole Stuart dynasty and the Civil War happening in the middle of the century. Finding a book that is specifically about those historical events would be good. Likewise, The Devil and Tom Walker is written in the 19th century in America, so a history that talks about like the early 19th century in America, and maybe also the Puritan period, since Irving is sort of talking about that in his 19th century milieu. All of this stuff would work. So in addition to, the scholars talking about the books themselves, there's plenty of stuff out there about the history, and I encourage you to go look for that as well. But again, keep it to peer-reviewed, like really academic scholars. Don't go find random sources like the History Channel or something to back up what you're saying here. Or if you do, always dig deeper, as we'll talk about in a little bit later. But thirdly, and this you are welcome to use, it's a little bit trickier in many cases, but I do want to sort of open the door to it. Feel free to use other important contemporaneous writers. Milton wasn't the only guy writing in 17th century England. There were tons of writers, there were tons of reviewers, there were tons of critics, and they all probably had something to say about Milton. Other important writers totally count for our purposes, especially in the humanities class where, the whole kind of point of this class is looking at the way writers have sort of changed their opinions and viewed each other over the course of time. Goethe is modifying the original Faust book, and every writer of a Faust story is modifying that same story in different ways over the course of time. They're commenting on Goethe, or they're revising Goethe, or they're changing Goethe, just as Goethe changed, the original story of Dr. Faustus. That's totally legit for this class. So feel free to track down other important writers, other important scholars, other thinkers over the course of this huge 500-year historical period, and bring them into your paper as corroborating resources or as ways of critiquing on the writers that you're talking about. What I don't want you to use, or rather what I don't want you to quote in your paper, first off is Wikipedia and other summaries. Like, I know it's going to be real tempting to just drag up SparkNotes or Wikipedia or some other source that just like directly comments on one of these texts by some weirdo on the internet. That's not okay for our purposes. Again, the thing that I'm trying to emphasize here is the scholarship. We're talking about peer-reviewed scholars, writers who are, teachers or professors at various academic institutions, authorities in their field. These are the people who write the books on Milton or on Goethe or on Marlowe or on Irving or whoever. And I don't want anything less than that, is basically what it comes down to. You shouldn't have any problem finding these. Like, even if you are stuck at home, can't get to the library, or can't find a book on time, it shouldn't be too difficult to just go poking around the internet for a little while, find out who these people are, and look for something that they've written that is authoritative on this subject. Um, Otherwise, also, do not use randos on the internet. Like, forget, Wikipedia and SparkNotes, they have their problems, but they are generally reliable insofar as, like, there are checks and balances against what they have to say. Wikipedia has a fairly elaborate peer reviewing system in its own network. They are not scholars in the same sense that, like, university professors or scholars, but at the same time, there is a certain amount of authority that a source like Wikipedia or SparkNotes or whatever carries, as a result. But you can also find tons of people writing blogs or making videos or doing whatever who don't have any authority in the field. Like, while you are researching, I would find it very unlikely, but it is entirely possible that you could stumble across my blog, at which I've, discussed quite a few of these sources in some detail. I get worked up about humanities classes outside of this class, so I occasionally write essays and stuff. But even if you find it, it shouldn't show up in your paper, because I am just a rando on the internet in that case. I do not include my scholarly credentials. I do not say where I am teaching. It is not an official peer-reviewed source. Like, my long, some 15-page meditation on Mikhail Bulgakov's The Devil or The Master and Margarita is not a reliable source. It is just me venting. And while I may be credible as a source, I'm not presenting it in a credible peer-reviewed environment. I want you to look for articles that are written by legitimate writers in a legitimate context, not randos on the internet publishing stuff on their blog, no matter how knowledgeable they may be. Now, that said, you can use both Wikipedia and these randos. In fact, I encourage you to use Wikipedia especially. Just don't quote them. Do not make that one of your two sources that you are going to include in the research paper. Wikipedia, SparkNotes, other summary sources like that, stuff like the History Channel, all of that can be used as sort of like a gateway source, as a way to start your research, but that shouldn't be where your research ends. So if you are going to use Wikipedia, great. Just remember to cite it, and remember not to quote it. That's the key. Wikipedia is not a reliable source in its own right, so look for the sources that Wikipedia is using, that Wikipedia themselves is citing. Hope that makes sense. But even if you do not quote Wikipedia, make sure to mention, yes, I used it in the creation of this paper. That's all I'm asking for here. Like, give me a note in your works cited page or your bibliography, just to say, I was on the Wikipedia page, I did look at it, and then I won't take it amiss if some of your language or some of your arguments look very similar to what Wikipedia had to say. So again, 3 possible good sources to avoid. Most importantly, we're looking for peer-reviewed scholarly sources, people who have published on this stuff, people who are experts in their field, people who are authorities. So with that in mind, let's dig in. So let's start, as all good research probably does, with a cursory Google search. So you'll notice that I typed in Milton, Paradise Lost. It's real easy to sort of get lost in your cursory Google search, especially in this class, because so many of our texts have roughly the same name or something. Like, if you type in, say, Faust, you're going to get, like, just a whole page from Wikipedia that has a whole bunch of different Fausts in it. You're going to have, like, Faust, Dr. Michael J. Faust, MD, gastroenterologist in New York City, Faust the band. We're going to get BBC articles, and we're going to get the Britannica article, and we're going to get, like, IMDb for the movie in 2011. Like, this is not a great search. It's not going to give you information about what you are looking for. This is just going to send you off on so many rabbit trails, and especially because our texts are so frequently named after one another. Like, if you type in Faust versus Dr. Faustus, you might get different results. If you get, you could get the references to the Faust book or the Faust opera or any number of other Faust stories that we haven't covered in this class. Like, even if you type in Dr. Faustus, which you would think is a little bit more specific, you'll find that Marlowe isn't necessarily the only one you're going to find. Like, you find Marlowe as your first couple of options, but you're also going to find Dr. Faustus by various other authors like Thomas Mann. It's just going to further confuse things, which is why throughout the class I've always emphasized the author's name as well as the title. When you search, you should do the same. If you search for Milton Paradise Lost, you know what text you're going for. Milton only wrote one Paradise Lost. If he wrote another one, he probably would have named it something different to keep everyone from being confused. So here, everything that we're getting is relevant. We get the Wikipedia article on Paradise Lost. We do get the BBC Culture article, which is fine. We get the SparkNotes page. We get a listing to the actual book on Amazon. We get various videos with plot summaries and analyses, all of which could be useful at the early stages of our search. We get wiki quote and we get various other things, but notice it's all John Milton, it's all Paradise Lost, it's all what we are looking for. So with that in mind, let's jump to the Wikipedia page. Here we have Paradise Lost, an epic poem in blank verse by the 17th century English poet John Milton, etc., etc. Now, already we have access to tons of great possible resources. Like, just look at all of the links here. We've got a link to John Milton himself, so we can look for biographical information about the author. It notes that a second edition followed in 1674, arranged into 12 books in the manner of Virgil's Aeneid, which maybe we should look up the Aeneid and see the sort of reference that Milton is making to it here. We get this brief description, and then we already have the table of contents. We have all of the characters. We have the plot synopsis in case we need to review that. We have each of the characters described and sort of explained here. We also scroll a little farther down and we get the motifs, the big themes, and the big symbols that we see over and over again. And very importantly, we have the interpretation and critique, which is sort of the center of what we should be looking for here in our Wikipedia page. Like, the quick and dirty research process would take us right here, because here we have yet another bunch of really great links. So notice the writer and critic Samuel Johnson wrote that Paradise Lost shows off Milton's peculiar power to astonish, and that Milton seems to have been well acquainted with his own genius, and to know that it was that nature had bestowed upon him more bountifully than others the power of displaying the vast, illuminating the splendid, enforcing the awful, darkening the gloomy, and aggravating the dreadful. So we have another author. We have Samuel Johnson, so we can look him up, and we can see what specifically he wrote about Paradise Lost. We also have this great little citation. 34 Johnson Samuel Lives of the English Poets, and we even have the book reference, New York Octagon 1967. Now, one of the main things that I expect you to do with a Wikipedia page, and basically the most useful part of a Wikipedia page for your purposes, is the references, the footnotes section, because these are all sources that are more likely to bring you, if not to a source that you can quote from your paper, something pretty close to it. Now, notice many of these do, in fact, have quotes in their own right. Like, you can click on many of these and get, that did not work. In theory, you should be able to get to quite a few of the actual books from here. Now, notice these are linking us to the bibliography. So we have John Broadbent's Paradise Lost introduction. We have Leonard, who is referred to frequently throughout this text, the introduction here. But note, we have a link. Oh, how convenient. It's actually the book that they wanted us to look at. So we can literally sit here and page through and we can read some of the introduction, although this one is apparently very limited. But we have the book, so even if we can't read it here online, we can definitely track it down. This is the Penguin Classics edition of John Milton's Paradise Lost. It's probably available at the library if you nab it. You can probably buy it as a Kindle book or something else for relatively cheap, because Penguin Classics are typically pretty accessible, or if you go a-searching, you can probably find it somewhere else for free or otherwise. So all of that is Very useful, very helpful. But let's keep looking at that interpretation section, because there's more that we can take away from here. Milton scholar John Leonard interpreted the impious war between heaven and hell as civil war. Paradise Lost is, among other things, a poem about civil war. Satan raises impious war in heaven by leading a third of the angels in revolt against God. The term impious war implies that civil war is impious, but Milton applauded the English people for having the courage to depose and execute King Charles I. In his poem, however, he takes the side of heaven's awful monarch. Critics have long wrestled with the question of why an anti-monarchist and defender of regicide should have chosen a subject that obliged him to defend monarchical authority. And here we come to one of the central discussions surrounding Milton's Paradise Lost. You remember back in my lecture, I argued that Milton was arguing for a pro-monarchist sentiment. But here we find there is apparently historical evidence that Milton was an anti-monarchist. Maybe now would be a good time to go check that Milton page and see what exactly the deal is there. So we have the Civil War, Prose Tracts, and Marriage, and we find out more information about Milton and whether or not he was arguing for or against the Civil War. But more importantly for us, we also have numerous other authors that are sort of weighing in on this discussion. So we have Leonard is the author of that introduction for the Penguin Classics edition. We have the editors of the Poetry Foundation argue that Milton's criticism of the English monarchy was being directed specifically at the Stuart monarchy and not at the monarchy system in general. And once again, we have a citation, so we can find the Poetry Foundation, and once again we have a link. How convenient. Hey, look at that. This would probably be much closer to a really solid source. At the very least, this would be a good time to sort of like research what's going on here. Notice that we have a link to the original page, which is apparently hosted at Dartmouth. Dartmouth is a legit like institution. So we have some evidence that this is probably a decent source to use. If we scroll down, let's see if they have any citations or resources. Kind of not finding any, so that's not great. We've also got, where do we have any author? An author would be great. That would be really helpful, and yet we do not see one. That's also a little frustrating and troublesome. But here we have another good source that we could look through to sort of better understand Milton's relationship to this conflict, how exactly it works. And this would be way closer to a scholarly source that we could actually use. But coming back to our Wikipedia page, we also have several other writers here. We have C.S. Lewis arguing that there was no contradiction in Milton's position, so we could track down where C.S. Lewis is writing about Milton. We've got other critics like William Empson, view it as a more ambiguous work, so we could track him down. And we also get Empson argued, or Leonard places Empson's interpretation in the romantic interpretive tradition of William Blake and Percy Bysshe Shelley. Blake famously wrote in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell the reason Milton wrote in Fetters when he wrote of angels and God, and at Liberty when of devils and hell, is because he was a true poet and of the devil's party without knowing it. So now we've already got like a huge number of potential places to sort of look for next. Now, I should stress that this isn't necessarily a great source to sort of be starting with. You'll notice that most of the citations refer to like number 35, and they also have a page needed reference. Source 35 is that very same source we keep running into, the introduction to Paradise Lost in that Penguin Classics edition. Now, it might very well be useful to just sort of like track down that particular source. So I went ahead and did that, the Leonard Introduction to Paradise Lost, and what do you know, I found the audiobook, which, hooray, for an Audible trial, I can read for free. But that isn't necessarily terribly good information for the Wikipedia page, at the very least. Like, using an introduction to a book like that is totally a legitimate thing to do. Most copies of classic works are reprinted with new introductions or new afterwords by noted scholars. But let's actually look up who this Leonard folk person is. So we have John Leonard, this writer of the introduction. Can we track down who this guy is, whether he is not whether he is a reliable scholar or not. Obviously, he is not an ice hockey player. Here is yet another problem with searching for just like a random name on the internet. So we're going to have to clarify. John Leonard, Department of English and Writing Studies. This sounds much more likely. So he has a bachelor's from Trinity, a MA from McMaster, and a PhD from Cambridge. That counts. That's a legitimate scholar. And then we have his primary interest is in John Milton. He is edited for Penguin Classics. Yep, this is the right guy. So this is the scholar we're dealing with. He is a legitimate source. If we can track down other things he's written, perhaps we will have a really good contemporary critical source. So at this point, let's turn our attention to that greatest of scholarly resources, Google Scholar. So I don't know if you are familiar with Google Scholar. Obviously, it is sort of a separate entity from Google at large. Google will give you sources from all over the internet, but Google Scholar is probably the single best source for tracking down scholarly resources. Yes, I've used databases like EBSCO and JSTOR, and they are way less powerful and way less helpful than Google Scholar consistently proves to be. You will be hunting forever if you use the library databases. Whereas if you can go to Google Scholar and start searching for something specific, like John Leonard Milton, well, now we have some really good sources. The Value of Milton, Faithful Laborers, A Reception History of Paradise Lost, Saying No to Freud, Milton's A Mask and Sexual Assault. This guy is not the same John Leonard. Again, be aware of, where they're publishing. The guy who's publishing the Journal of Biological Chemistry is not the same John Leonard as the one who is writing about Milton. But here we have, legit books. We have actual good resources that we could track down. Notice, too, that they will include the database and the location where you can find them. So we can look at this and find it on books.google.com, apparently. So once again, we've got a source right here, and while it's not as consistent as we would like, it probably does not include everything that we want. At least here's a good start until we can track it down in person and in print somewhere. We can also find, now that we've got the name of an essay, now that we've got an actual source to look for, we can track it down through one of those library databases. So let's bring up our favorite library page real fast. Now we can actually search for a specific article, for something that we are specifically looking for, and that'll make our searching way easier. So we can just copy the article name in here, and hopefully the library will direct us. Bam! Saying No to Freud, Milton's A Mask and Sexual Assault, PDF full text. All we have to do is sign in, and it is all ours. So now we've got a legit source, an actual academic scholar who has published on the subject extensively. We have the article, and all we have to do is sign in, and we can get the PDF, bring it up, and read it. So that's one source down. That is the first of our sources, critique and discussion by contemporary scholars. Leonard counts. Leonard is totally interested in this stuff. He is a totally legitimate source. But now let's look for one of our other sources. Let's look for some historical contextualization. Now, we talked a lot about how Paradise Lost is sort of rooted in the 17th century. It's rooted in that big British Civil War. So at this point, it would make sense to sort of look around for links and sort of go Wikipedia digging to try and find other relevant sources. So let's look at this whole King Charles I business. So we get our whole source on King Charles I, and once again, we have tons and tons of links. Anytime that you're looking at a major historical figure or a major historical event, you will find tons and tons of links to all sorts of things. Now, of course, what we are ultimately looking for is the execution. Charles I had quite a long reign. He did a lot of stuff, but really at the end of the day, what we are more interested in is the execution. Where was Milton as far as that was concerned? And we have, here's some description of the beheading. Here are some of the events that led up to it. But notice we also have all of these sources. So by looking down at the extensive reference listings here, which this is all very good for us. This indicates that we are dealing with a really good Wikipedia page that is very well researched, not like that other one where we were getting all of our information from the same John Leonard introduction. Now we've got Carleton 1995, we've got Hibbert 1968, we've got Gregg 1981, like all of these potential sources that are very useful. And all you need to do is mouse over them, and we've got the name of the book, Charles I, the Personal Monarch. We've got King Charles I from Pauline Gregg. We've got Christopher Hibbert's Charles I. All of these could potentially be good sources. If anything, we might have too much information here. We don't know which one to track down. Fortunately, we also have a couple that do give us direct links, like this official website of the British monarchy. So we can track that down, and as an official site of the British monarchy, it would once again count as a good source, and we could look at it and get a sort of sense of who is Charles I, what, assuming that, we actually can link to it. If we can find out who Charles I is, if we can sort of understand that and contextualize what Milton has to say, that's another reliable source. So let's go ahead and track down Mr. Charles I again. Look at one of these other sources. Let's see if we can find this Carleton entry, because that one seems to be coming up most frequently. So we have Charles Carleton, Charles I. And already we have a JSTOR PDF. This admittedly is just a review. This is what you've got to be careful about here. Notice that it is by L.L. Peck, not by Charles Carleton. In fact, most of your JSTOR searches will probably yield these sorts of misgivings, like you do not want a review of the book, you want the actual book. Notice that we once again can preview it. Thank you, Google Books, so helpful. So we have 50 pages here, which we might be able to dig out something useful. And if not, again, this is one that we can search for. Now that we've got the name of the book, I bet you can find it in the library page. If we come to a dead end, well, you are more than welcome to track down any of the other options here, all of which would probably be pretty solid. Now, honestly, looking for a biography of Charles I isn't necessarily what we should be looking for. That, as important as it would probably be sort of secondary to looking at the actual political discussion surrounding his execution. What we need to talk about is the English Civil War. That's the issue that Milton is specifically talking to. So once again, some more Wikipedia digging, another Wikipedia page, another extremely well-researched page with lots of different sources, and all of which could very well be used to sort of set us down the next of our rabbit holes. So again, like, Wikipedia is great because it links you to everything within Wikipedia, and then from there you can seek out those scholarly sources, get better information, and really learn what there is to know about whatever it is that you're talking about. So let's call that done for our second kind of source, the historical contextualization, seeing as we've got so many different potential books that we could track down, and I'm sure at least one of them we can get from the library or something like that. Let's look at this third one just in case, the other important contemporaneous writers. Unfortunately, that one we stumbled across real early. Remember, we found that little note here that Blake famously wrote in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, the reason Milton wrote in Fetters when he wrote of angels and God, etc., etc. Blake is obviously commenting on Milton, sort of critiquing him. And Blake isn't contemporaneous with Milton. Blake actually wrote a good 150-ish years after Milton. The Marriage of Heaven and Hell was written in the late 18th century, and it was actually contemporaneous with Goethe. But we can totally use it because it's humanities. These guys commenting on each other is one of the things that we're doing a lot in this class. So The Marriage of Heaven and Hell would totally count as a legitimate source for us, especially if we can contextualize Blake and sort of like put him in the greater sphere of like how does Faust literature work over these 500 years. And this is super easy. All we have to do is go to Project Gutenberg, and there it is, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell by William Blake. One cursory search, and all of a sudden, here we are looking at the text. If we could do a little bit of a search, but fortunately, we don't even have to do that. It comes really early. So here is the line. and notice that it is contextualized. Blake is responding deliberately to Milton. So we get, in the book of Job, Milton's Messiah is called Satan, for this history has been adopted by both parties. Reading through the marriage of heaven and hell would be a totally legitimate way to complete this assignment, sort of like bounce these thinkers off of one another. Blake's interpretation of Milton is very much a valuable insight, and would count as research for this class. So again, like lots of potential options for what you could be researching, lots of potential scholars and writers and thinkers and really good peer-reviewed sources that you could potentially be digging from. We've got our John Leonard article, if we want to use that. We've got various other articles by Leonard or books by Leonard that we can track down if we want to. And this is all before we get into The Devil and Tom Walker by Irving. Do this again for Irving and you will undoubtedly find a solid second source, no problem. And again, this took only like half an hour, and as I was narrating it, like it took me 15 minutes to find Leonard's article before I sort of started recording. It isn't incredibly time consuming. Now, admittedly, it will take longer when you're actually reading all this stuff, but honestly, like, finding a good source and finding a bad source take roughly the same amount of time. The key here is you've got to be able to put in the work, learn what there is to learn about this stuff, and actually present a decent context for what you were talking about here. And I know that like you're probably looking at this and thinking this sounds really tedious, this sounds really exhausting. It would be way easier to just sort of like quote Wikipedia and call it a day, or just find one of these sources and just like find a line, stick it, copy and paste it into my paper. There's my research done. And I know in many cases you will probably do this. You're under the gun, you don't have a lot of time. This isn't the class you want to spend all your time on. That's fine. The reason why I want to stress this, why I want to teach this to you, is not for this class. It's for your next class, and for the class that you're taking for your major, and for the 400 level class where like this is where you really need to put in the work. I want to stress to you that like this is the soul of academic research, having all these friggin' tabs open, looking up your resources, tracking down what lots of different writers have to say about the subject, and just digging deep into this discussion surrounding these ideas, these historical periods, these writers, these thoughts. That's what academia is all about. And research is the fundamental skill set that makes that happen. Like if you learn anything from your college career, it should be this: how to go around and look at all of the different people talking about any particular subject. How to find reliable sources and how to recognize a bad source when you see it, something that's either irrelevant or unhelpful or otherwise. How to know how to do a good Google search as opposed to a fairly useless one. And what I want to stress here is that you should be able to do this. Like, not that you have to do it for every single paper that you ever write. Like, I know that a lot of the assignments I'm going to see at the end of this semester are going to be students blowing off the assignment, and that's fine. Like, it sucks because I have to read them and grade them as though they're every bit as serious as anyone else's work. But at the same time, like, that's okay. You should prioritize your time according to what you value, what you care about. If you don't have the time to put in like hours and hours of research on my assignment to really learn all the stuff that I'm trying to teach you, you will still probably pass this class. If you throw in some, 2-bit quote from some 2-bit author, you'll still probably get a B or C on the paper if that's what you want to do. But if you want to go for the A, this is what it looks like. And what's more, you should at some point. Maybe not for this class, but down the road. And at some point in your college career, you should make the effort just to know that you can, to see if you like it. Researching is honestly really fun when you get good at it and when you know what you're looking for and when you're really interested in what these various sources and authors have to say. Like nothing makes me happier than a student who, comes to my class and is reading philosophy or is reading some of these texts for the first time and they get into it. Like maybe they were resistant at first. Maybe they hated Marlowe. Maybe they hated Milton. But then they read Goethe, or then they read Irving, or then they read one of the other sources, and it lit them up. Like, now they're interested, now they're curious, now they want to know, how does the opera work for Mozart's Don Giovanni? How what is the romantic influence on or how does like Don Giovanni prefigure romanticism? How is Byron responding to romantic traditions? How is Dostoevsky critiquing romantic idealism? I've seen students go nuts, find cool sources, like dig deep into the historical context, dig deep into these authors, and really learn stuff about them. And if they, bring me a paper with stuff that I've never seen before, with research that they've honestly conducted, those are the students who are going to run away with the A's. Show me something new, and I will be way more generous to your paper. And get excited about it. Like, again, maybe not in this class, but down the road, some other class, some other subject, who knows? I know that this is a tough one, that there's a lot of reading and not a lot of time to do it in. But some time before you leave college, write a good paper. Do some solid research. Make the legitimate effort, because you might just enjoy it. And if you do, that will be really helpful to you. Like, whether you decide to pursue a career in academia or not, research is an invaluable skill these days. Everyone needs to be able to do this. That's how you get informed. That's how you become a smarter person. All of this information is at your fingertips. I didn't spend a dime to find any of these sources, to open up any of these pages. And, it admittedly is a little bit more time consuming when you can't just log into your Montclair account and get the source that you were looking for. But even so, like, a lot of these, I bet, if we were really careful, we could probably track down these sources as free editions online, or find, enough of the Google book to be able to track it down. Or, God forbid, we order a book on Amazon and get it in 2 days. I've done that a couple of times, many of which were garbage, and then I had to, return them or something. But it's Amazon. They immediately give you your money back. Like, I'm sure some of you can game that system. Come on. You're all smart, capable individuals. By all means, return a couple of books after you leaf through them and find the requisite quote. Go for it. It may be immoral from our perspective, but it's Amazon. They're horrible. It's a giant corporation of nightmares. And, what does it cost you at the end of the day but learning something? So anyway, go nuts. Find new stuff, find stuff that I don't know, correct me, challenge me, do whatever. Just give it a shot. Again, now or later or whenever, just do not leave college until you've done this at some point, until you've had a go at it. And feel free to bookmark this video and just refer to it whenever you need to. Obviously, we're talking about humanities here specifically, but this applies. Like, obviously, we found, the Journal of Biological Chemistry in our process here. This could work for, your science research or whatever. So yeah, this is my method. If you've got another method and it works, then absolutely don't feel obligated to do mine. But, after going through 2 master's programs and being in academia for the better part of 10 years, this is the system that works the best for me. And nobody taught it to me. Nobody sat me down and did this in a video. I had to just sort of just piece it out for myself. And it honestly took me until the end of my first master's to figure this out. But this is what works. Like, start with your big summary sources like Wikipedia. Go looking for, specific writers, specific authors, specific articles. Go to Google Scholar, track down, the specific source that you want, and then track it down through the library or wherever. That's the process. That's the quickest way to get to something really, really good. To sort of keep from wasting your time and just getting random books from the library or reading articles that have nothing to do with what you're talking about. You can afford to pick and choose if you use this method, which is way better than, just sort of typing random words in a JSTOR and hoping something shows up. And Lord knows I've had my fair share of papers where the student doesn't even know which version of Faust they're actually talking about. So at the very least, figure that out. Obviously, if you have any questions about this, We can discuss it in class, in the chat, however this particular class is working. Feel free to email me. Feel free, if you have questions, feel free to ask me. Like, here is a source that I found. Is it a good source? Why or why not? Or for that matter, just ask. Like, I'm having a lot of trouble finding a source. Most of this stuff I know well enough that I can track down a good source, again, in 10, 15 minutes. So I'm not above helping you. Like, I won't write your paper for you, but I can definitely point you to some good sources if you really are struggling. And I can definitely show you how to refine your research if you want to do that. So let me know. Like, feel free to include me. I am, I want to see the best paper I can. Like, I want to read it because it's more interesting to me. Like, I'd rather read it than just another, half-assed attempt at just snowing me and getting the like B minus and calling it a day. So I want your paper to be good. I want you to get a good grade. I want you to know how to do this, and I am willing to help in any way that I can. So let me know. Like, keep me informed. Keep me in the loop. And until then, just let me know. Like, email me if you have problems, questions, whatever. And again, after this, watch the video on writing the research paper, and we will help sort of like clarify and refine what it is I'm looking for in the paper itself. So in the meantime, enjoy your research, enjoy your reading. Good luck to you.